Hey Simon, very nice to meet you again.
Nice to talk to you today, Fabian.
I really appreciate it. I know both quite busy at the minute that you make time for this. Today's conversation is of course centered around all things electric vehicles, EV charging, and then at the end we're also gonna look ahead at what next with AI and related fields in charging. You're in charge of EV charging at McLaren Applied, and when we hear McLaren or think about McLaren as a brand, most of us, including myself, think about the 750S or any other McLaren super car. But let's talk a little bit about McLaren Applied first. What specifically is your focus? Where do you sit in the McLaren business? And then afterwards, we are going to talk a little bit about your current role.
Perfect. Yeah. No, so you're absolutely right. Yeah, I lead the EV charging business line here at McLaren Applied. I think you're right. When you think about McLaren, you normally think about either the world's best supercars and hypercars, or you think about papaya orange racing cars going around very fast Formula One tracks and IndyCar tracks, and actually doing very well at the moment. And McLaren Applied we're not the sports car company. That's McLaren Automotive. We're not the Formula One or the IndyCar company. That's McLaren Racing. So I work for McLaren Applied, which used to be the third division in the McLaren Group. Perhaps not many people know that we actually got spun out about 4 years ago, just after the pandemic. So we're now a completely independent company, but we still have very close connections with the McLaren Group. As a company, Fabian, we are just before we were spun out, we are a technology and products focused company. That's what we do. Yes, when we were still part of the group, we had two big sisters in McLaren Automotive and McLaren Racing, and both of those sisters had very loud voices. And now we're independent, and we're private equity backed. It's actually a good news story because we've got a company that's investing in us, and we're growing.
What are some of the companies that you work with? Of course, you don't have to share any names, just in terms of generally what types of organizations do you partner with?
Great question. Yeah. So as a products and technology business, we have four main product lines, and you won't be surprised to learn that the biggest of those product lines is our motorsport division. So to give you an example of the types of companies we work with and the types of products we do, every Formula One car on the grid has a standard engine control unit. And that's a product that is designed, developed, built and supplied by McLaren Applied. So our customers, as an example, are every single Formula One team on the grid. So we supply McLaren Racing, we supply Ferrari, we supply Red Bull through a contract that we've got with the FIA. We also supply, in a very similar way, all of the IndyCar teams on the grid and all of the NASCAR teams on the grid. So that gives you an example of the motorsport division. One of the adjacent sectors that we work in is automotive, of course. And we do a lot of work in high performance power electronic systems. So we've just recently been working on, and it's now been launched, our 800-volt silicon carbide inverter, which is a very high performance EV inverter product. And we're supplying that to lots of car companies. Most of them we can't name, of course, because of commercial confidentiality. But one of the ones that is in the public domain is a company called Zinger Motors, who make an extraordinary supercar that they build out in California. And what's also interesting about those sorts of products is that they're very relevant and very interesting to adjacent markets. So because our products are very lightweight, very high performance, very power dense, you won't be surprised to learn that they're very interesting to the aerospace market and sector. And indeed, we have multiple aerospace customers for our 800-volt silicon carbide inverter. And I think doing that kind of work, looking at high performance power electronics, onboard charging, DC-DC converters, battery systems, led us to the path of, well, what else could we do? What else could we apply our skills and technologies to? And about 2 years ago, we decided to look at the electric vehicle charging market, and my role is heading up that division. So just to briefly touch on that, as a business line, we offer very high performance, very high quality and high reliability EV charging products. And that's everything from 7 kilowatts and 22 kilowatts AC home charger products, right the way through to our top end beyond 700 kilowatt dynamic charging products. And what we do is we serve customers such as the charge point operators out there in the UK and fleets, so fleet managers, and we help them to unlock electric vehicle potential by charging their cars at up to a kilometre a second. And a kilometre a second means that you can get 180 miles or more in just 5 minutes. So it's a bit like a McLaren pit stop for electric vehicles.
Oh, fascinating. Thanks so much for the overview. That's super helpful. Before we talk about all things charging, it's of course sort of the second side of the coin to electric vehicles, and it's often seen as the bottleneck or a concern when it comes to the adoption of electric vehicles, but it very much seems like a chicken and egg problem. But that means that it could be quite important to talk about EV adoption first. And when we briefly spoke a couple of weeks ago, I loved how you described your thinking around the sort of brief history of electric vehicles with your four waves model. So the question is, what are the four waves of electrification and why do they matter?
Yeah, no, happy to take you through those. I think another important point to make as I go through this is to say that we are really seeing now some very affordable, some very exciting electric vehicle models, and I think our ways of electrification maybe helps to bring some depth and some texture to why we're seeing that. So let's talk about the waves. The first wave of electrification. Let's not say that it was 125 years ago when the automobile was invented, even though we did see EVs all the way back then. But we're not really talking about that. We're talking about the start of mass adoption of electric vehicles, and that probably happened in around about 2008, maybe between 2008 2012, that sort of time frame. Kickstarted by some really niche products like the original Tesla Roadster that was based on the Lotus Elise. I don't know if you remember that one. And then the real introduction of mass electric vehicle adoption with obviously the Nissan Leaf and the Renault Zoe and those products. I think that's really the start of mass adoption, and of course the Tesla Model S around that sort of time. That was the first wave. We then saw the second wave of electric vehicles, and that really came in around about 2018, probably driven more by legislation, emissions legislation. And also there was definitely some early customer demand from those early adopters. And that was kind of what we call the rush to market, the OEM rush to market, and characterized by vehicles like the Jaguar I-Pace, the original Audi e-tron vehicles, some of the Mercedes EQ series. But we saw a lot of those cars were, let's say, not optimized. A lot of them were based on internal combustion engine vehicles that had just been electrified. So really suboptimal cars. And that took us to the third wave, what we call the third wave of electric vehicles. And I think that really started as early as, say, 2022, was maybe 2022, when we saw Mercedes-Benz launch a car called the EQXX. They actually launched it at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, although we were going through the pandemic, so it was a bit of a tricky launch. But when you look at that car, it had incredible, amazing aerodynamics. It had skinny tires, but most importantly, it had incredible powertrain efficiency. And really, that was about starting to optimize electric vehicles and make them as efficient as possible. And we're really starting to see that now coming through today's cars. So you can look at electric vehicle platforms like the VW Audi Group J1 platform, which the Porsche Taycan is based on, and the Audi e-tron GT. And then, of course, much more mainstream vehicles like the Hyundai Kia eGMP platform, which the Ioniq 5 and the EV6 is based on. And these are 800 volt electrical architecture platforms. And what that allows you to do is start to really get a lot more efficiency flowing through your electric powertrains. And also quite conveniently, it allows for faster charging, which is a bit of a connection, which I'm sure we'll come back to in a little while. 800 volt vehicles were fairly rare a few years ago, but we're really now starting to come into the mainstream with many products from companies like Mercedes-Benz launching the CLA later this year, the BMW Neue Class platform coming out in end of this year, next year. Ford are launching 800 volt vehicles. Even Tesla, the Cybertruck, is an 800 volt platform. And I think car companies are realizing that optimization and efficiency really is the way forwards for electric vehicles. So that's what we're seeing today. These dedicated EV architectures focusing on efficiency. But I think we can't stop at today. We have to think about what's next and what's the future. So we think that the fourth wave of electrification actually comes down to taking that efficient architecture and actually differentiating it to make a better customer experience. That's where we think it's going to go next. And again, we're starting to see glimpses of that coming through with products like the Ionic N product, which is an electric vehicle that has a simulated gear shifter. It has noise synthesis, and it's really starting to build kind of character and brand into the driving experience to make it something that the customer really enjoys. And we see that coming through things like NVH development. And one of the really important things to do in NVH is to make anything that you do from a sound perspective, you need to make it authentic. So if you can tap into the motor of an electric vehicle and generate a noise that is synthesized with the harmonics of the motor, then you're starting to generate something that is true to the car, and you can start to tune it from a brand perspective to give you a customer experience. And then equally, you can look at a lot of the electric vehicles that are out there, and they will go from 0 to 60 in as fast as you want. But that's kind of all they do. It's very one-dimensional. And I think in the fourth wave, we'll start to see OEMs and car companies really start to use things like our 800-volt silicon carbide inverter that we've developed, which has very fine motor control. So you can start to tune dynamic characteristics into vehicles, and you can start to bring a real brand character through into an electric vehicle. So we think, that's great for maybe higher performance cars, sportier cars, but it also has applications in commercial vehicles. Because when you're carrying a very fragile load, you don't want a jerky car. You want a soft start and a soft stop. And all of that can be easily tuned in using kind of fine motor control. So we think, differentiating the customer experience as the EV market matures, we think that's the fourth wave of electrification. Hopefully that makes sense. And that's how we see the world of electric vehicles moving forwards.
Now, it's a really, really interesting classification. It's especially for, I could imagine, someone who isn't working in the industry, otherwise quite hard to understand why electric vehicles from, let's say, 15 years ago are fundamentally different. And some of these initial misconceptions, I think it's fair to say, are quite sticky, even if we still look at surveys today. And for people like ourselves that work either in exactly this field or related field, it almost seems a little bit unfair in some respects. Doesn't mean that everything is perfect, but some of these misconceptions are, I guess, arguably there, and some of these initial challenges have certainly been overcome. A little bit of a potentially loaded question before we move on to EV charging. In this sort of fourth wave that you referred to of software-defined, more optimized vehicles, where do you see the role of some of these new brands that we've seen, some of these new kits on the block that weren't necessarily part of the first two, maybe even first three waves?
So help me understand your question. When you say the new kids, what are you referring to?
So there are some competitors from China. I mean, there are some, I guess, brands that are quite big in EV already. I'm not sure if BYD is the first or second largest seller of EVs, but they arguably have been not so popular before, and at least here in Central Europe and in the US. And now I see them around here in a fairly historic, old-fashioned British town quite frequently, which is arguably new. So there's a question around where you see, and we don't have a crystal ball, of course, but where do you see developing into, and potentially what does it mean for some of the incumbents if we assume that the automotive market overall is at least somewhat saturated? And then I guess what we've seen over the past couple of years is more bespoke vehicles and partnerships, for example, for logistics companies like Amazon has some partnerships in this space for delivery vehicles. And there's a question of whether you see this continuing or whether this will sort of move back to some of the traditional incumbents where I would sort of talk about brands that have been around for 100 plus years, or if you think they might struggle to defend their currently quite dominant market positions.
I think it's genuinely fascinating to see what's going to happen over the coming years. I think the first point I'll make is that the Chinese brands are, frankly, they're already here and they've been here for a while. So Geely is a great example because they own Volvo, they own Polestar, they own Lotus, they own the London Electric Vehicle Company. NG have been here for a while because they are owned by SAI. And then we're seeing the kind of the newer entrants to market, like the BYDs, like the JQs, like the Omodos, like the Aura. It used to be the Funky Cat, but they've rebranded it. And that's a Great Wall Motors company. So Chinese cars are already here, and I think they're here to stay. I think they are driving competition, which I think is maybe the incumbent OEMs won't agree, but I think competition's always going to be a good thing to see. And from if I was to kind of take my EV charging hat off and put more of an automotive OEM hat on, we see the emerging technology that's coming through. We talk about solid state batteries, and we've talked about them as always being 5 or 10 years away, and they still seem to be 5 or 10 years away. But there are companies out there, particularly Chinese companies, that are really pushing strongly battery technology, and in particularly the C rating of batteries, which is all about charging speed. And it's inevitable that we will just see this flow through into more mainstream, more passenger cars as we go over the next few years. And there are companies out there like Xpeng or Xiaopeng, Verizon in the commercial vehicle market, that's a Geely company, Leap Motor, who have got a partnership with Stellantis, Avatar, Airways, Li Auto, Ato, companies that maybe we've never even heard of that I think are going to really come and shake up the market, particularly in the UK. So I think it's a really exciting time. And I think the other point to make really is that when people think about future automotive technology, you automatically think about the battery because it's kind of a big part of a car, and it's a big important part, and it's a lot of investment. So it's not surprising that people talk about that. But there are other parts, and the power electronics, the motor technology, with some really cutting edge, even kind of UK companies like YASA who are moving that forwards. Elafe are a European company that are pushing forwards on in-wheel motors, and companies like McLaren who are really developing. McLaren Applied are developing high performance power electronics to drive the motor. We're going to see a lot more efficiency, and I hope we'll see a lot more talk about vehicle efficiency, because what we can't do is we can't keep on putting bigger and bigger batteries into cars. This is not sustainable. We have to have smaller batteries. We have to have more efficient vehicles with longer range and with faster charging. And I think that's what we'll see. If I had my crystal ball, Fabienne, that's I think what we'll see in the future.
No, super interesting. Really appreciate the perspective. And I think it's a perfect segue to the sort of second half of this conversation. You've done some work on mapping these 4 waves of electrification. So just to recap that, mass electrification or beginnings of mass electrification, brand-specific electric car models, dedicated EV platforms, and then software-defined vehicles to 4 waves of EV charging. So would love to hear more about what they are. And then just to pick up on at least 2 points you mentioned there that I get quite a few questions on, and that always come up in industry conferences, are things like battery costs. So how have the battery costs roughly evolved, which then of course are passed on to the consumer, at least indirectly. And secondly, solid state batteries. I still remember when I started my PhD, I don't know, or had first conversations related to automotive research, maybe seven years ago or so. This was already one of the sort of big hot topics in the battery space back then. So maybe briefly touching on what it is, where it fits into this picture, and what role you see solid state batteries play in the future.
So I'm going to take a soft pass on your battery question because I'm definitely not a battery expert. So forgive me. I think what I will say on the battery side is that motorsport is driving a lot of innovation. I think a lot more than people actually realize. There are technologies that have kind of trickled down from the obvious stuff like advanced materials. It starts in motorsport, it kind of moves into the hypercar, supercar domain, and eventually it kind of trickles its way down into more mainstream automotive applications, and then off into other industries like like commercial vehicles and other adjacent sectors. And on the battery side, clearly, Formula One is taking a much more of it's not an internal combustion engine, it's a power unit. And the power unit has batteries and power electronics. And every single time a Formula One car does a lap, It fully charges and fully discharges. So it's going through a very, very fast cycling of the battery chemistry, and all of that learning and all of that technology through the OEMs themselves directly, like Mercedes-Benz, who are in the Formula One domain. McLaren, of course, are in the Formula One domain. All of that technology is filtering its way through to automotive. So forgive me for taking a soft pass on the solid state and battery cost questions that you made, but very happy to move to mapping the EV charging world across those 4 waves of electrification, if that's okay.
Yeah, sounds good.
So we talked about the first wave, sort of the start of massive electrification back in 2008, maybe 2010. Let's look at that from an EV charging perspective. And back then, I mean, that was really building the foundation, a really nascent sector of EV charging, very early charging technology, very slow, inconsistent charging back then, and completely lacked any kind of standardization back in those days. Fast forwards to that kind of period I talked about in 2018, when we were starting to see mass adoption from the OEMs. I think on the EV charging world, in the EV charging world, you have to think about this more from a sort of an infrastructure, putting in infrastructure. So building, construction, it's a really different world from the automotive OEM world. And actually what we saw back then was a lot of what people refer to as kind of land grab. So they would be people that would be just finding land and putting charging in. And perhaps it wasn't so intelligently thought through. It was just about putting chargers in the ground. That seemed to be the most important thing to do at the time. And also back then, again, it doesn't feel like that long ago, but you'll probably remember back then that there was, several hundred apps and lots of different cards, and again, no consolidation, and probably quite a lot of consumer frustration because you didn't have the right app, or you had to download this app, and to get the charging to work, it was all a bit frustrating. So that was really about accelerating growth and starting to standardize. Moving forwards to the kind of the 2022 to today really. Really, this is about preparing for mass transition into EV charging. So the focus is on certainly being a lot more intelligent about charging locations. There's a lot of, maybe this is a bit of an kind of myth busting really, but people say that charging isn't working because there isn't a lot of utilization. But it's not surprising when you've put chargers in the wrong place, then of course they won't be utilized. Now, the charging locations are much more intelligently thought through. There's a lot more charging density, so a lot more chargers in the ground. We're now starting to see a lot more focus on charging speed. So even a few years ago, 50 kilowatt chargers were like cutting edge. And now we're up to at least 350 kilowatts in the UK, pushing up towards 400 kilowatts rapid charging, and a lot more focus, driven by government legislation, a lot more focus on reliability and uptime. And all of that is really important for the user experience. And we're starting to see a lot more standardization. So everything's just getting a lot better as the electric vehicle sector gets better. So a bit like the onboard space, we're thinking about what's next and what's coming next. And I think actually there are quite a lot of parallels with, on the vehicle side, we talked about customer experience and sort of branding being important. And I think that really also mirrors over to the charging space. So we're seeing, I think, the future being all about consolidation. So there are a lot of players in the market, both from an operating perspective, a charge point operating perspective, we think there's going to be consolidation, but also from an equipment perspective, we think there's going to be some consolidation in the marketplace. And we think that consolidation is going to move towards kind of future-proofing the infrastructure, having ultra reliable charging. We think speed is going to go up. As the battery technology improves, we think speed is going to go up, as our charging speeds will go up. But all of this is really about giving the consumer and the customer a better charging experience. And those charge point operators that have the best equipment, that have all of the right amenities, even from the basic stuff like canopies to stop the weather coming in, lighting, security, the right amenities at the charging points, all of that right the way through to some of the more advanced features in the chargers, I think is going to create a better customer experience and brand loyalty in the EV charging space. And then just briefly we talk a lot about this from a kind of public charging perspective. So, you and I and the general public going to charge. But we also see this mirrored in the B2B space, in the fleet vehicle market. So as more electric vehicles come onto fleets for electric vans, and then the bigger stuff, the EHGV stuff, again, it's all about those experiences being seamless and unobtrusive for fleets and for fleet managers, because for them, it's all about uptime, having their vehicles on the road, so having fast chargers to help them to do that. And that's really how we see the waves of electrification mirroring in the EV charging space.
No, thanks so much, Simon. It's a really clear overview and helpful way to think about the different iterations or stages. Two follow-up questions there. One related to the third waves, this 2022 to today phase. Is there a lot of variation in terms of the maturity, deployment, and rollout across countries, and which countries, if so, are leading? And if you like to talk about this, why do you believe that's the case?
There is. So let me focus on Europe. As we all know, in the electric vehicle side, there are some countries. I think Norway's a great example where they're now above 95% new car sales is electric vehicle, and they started their electric vehicle strategy a long time ago. More than 10 years ago, and they're well on the path of a kind of electric vehicle, I won't say saturation, but they're moving heavily towards mass adoption of electric vehicles. But of course, Norway is a country of only 5 million people, and there are 10 million people or more than 10 million people in London. So it's a great case study. It's a great example, and they're doing amazing things. If I then kind of translate that to EV charging, there's big variation, really big variation across different countries. So Germany are doing great at the moment. France are doing great at the moment. Driven by government policy, driven by energy strategy, and they're doing really well. There are other countries like Spain and I think Italy, if I'm not mistaken. They're not doing so well. They're lagging behind. Big opportunities to put EV charging infrastructure, but they're big countries. So again, it's not a small challenge. It's a big challenge. If I talk about the UK, actually, we're doing pretty well. We have got just over 75,000, pushing up towards 80,000 public EV chargers. Just over 15,000 of those are what are classed as rapid chargers, 150 kilowatts and above. And the UK government has set a target to get that from 100,000 public charging points to 300,000 public charging points by 2030. So I'd say on balance, we're actually doing quite well. We're doing well. And sometimes we like to focus on the negatives, but I think we should also focus on the positives. So I think we're doing quite well in that space. Maybe just to briefly say that the government has starting to really take a hard look at EV charging in a good way. So there's been some legislation that's gone in back end of last year around uptime for EV chargers to have more than 99% uptime. And that will be great for the consumer experience or the customer experience. So you don't turn up as you used to do maybe a few years ago, turn up to a charger that looks like it's live on the app, and you turn up and it's out of use. And there is also more government funding initiatives that are coming through that are helping to spur both the AC charging for home charging, but also for public charging as well. Lots of activity, really exciting space. And as I say, on balance, I think the UK are doing well, but we can always do better.
In this final category and linking this conversation a little bit to AI is where some of the AI optimizations that both happen in the background, like you mentioned, I believe power management as one example, but also in the sort of customer-facing space in terms of personalized journey optimizations, recommendations, making the best use, whatever that means to the individual, out of the charging time. As it relates to EV charging on sort of the 10,000 foot view, what are some of the current AI applications that you see? And then sort of looking forward, how do you believe this could evolve?
So I think that this is a really interesting time because I think there is a lot of potential, and this is a very nascent sector for AI. I think probably the best examples that I can offer that are in the public domain, because clearly there's a lot of stuff going on that isn't. But a lot of the kind of public domain stuff comes through helping the customer experience to be better. in EV charging. And the example that probably most of us perhaps know about, maybe don't realize is happening in the background, is our mapping apps. So we use all of the Waze and Google Maps, and they are getting smarter and smarter. And I'm sure we will have noticed that in the background, AI is working on those. It's following the patterns of how we use those mapping apps. And if we happen to go to a certain location at a certain time of day, then the AI is working in the background to offer you suggestions so that you actually don't have to type the location in. It will automatically do that for you. And I can see that very quickly can be adopted in the EV charging space. There are some great companies out there like ZapMap and others that map all of the EV chargers in the UK, for example. I can see that the AI could be deployed into a mapping application to improve the customer experience, and that could be done through kind of smart filtering. So if you're a particular customer that happens to want to have certain amenities, AI at your charging site, and then you could program that in to your app, for example, and the AI will point you in a certain direction. If you want a certain cost of charge, then the AI could certainly filter that down even further. And I think you could see that kind of technology perhaps being very powerful across businesses. So fleet managers could use the data that they collect on their fleets. They could map the electric vehicle charging patterns that they're using, and they could start to use that to be a lot more intelligent about their EV charging. So that's one application that I can see. I can see it being deployed. I'd also go maybe slightly back towards the EV charging equipment, and all of this stuff. We've got to be a bit careful about IP, Fabian, but we could imagine a world where you've got technology that you've got on your vehicle where it tells you when your car is ready to go for a service. So that's been around for a while. It's like a predictive maintenance type of approach. I believe that on the vehicle there are sensors that are measuring oil conditions. They're keeping an eye on the brake pads, and ultimately, rather than getting your car serviced once a year, it's actually telling you that it's ready to service before a year or maybe even if you're lucky, after 18 months, based on the condition of the vehicle. And I can imagine a world where all of that technology is applied to EV charging. And actually, not only are you starting to collect data on the chargers, and you're starting to create a predictive maintenance routine and regime to make sure you've got that good uptime that you need on the EV charging. I can imagine that going the next step further with AI, and actually you're starting to do some kind of AI-driven predictive analytics and actually doing a bit of condition insight and condition monitoring. So you're getting the right servicing parts ready, and actually you're starting to get those services in before the charger's starting to show any signs of degradation. So I can see a world where AI can be extremely helpful, both for the consumer experience, but also for the people that are operating the chargers.
No, thanks so much, Simon. That was an incredibly useful overview. Is there anything as relates to not just AI in EV charging, but EV charging generally, that I could have or should have asked you about, but didn't, that you believe could be important to highlight?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is a world that is, I think it's very different from the automotive world, and different, but in a sort of an equally exciting way. I guess my parting comment would be we've seen so many changes in the automotive sector in the last 10 years. It's changing more now, I think, than it's ever changed in its more than 125-year history. And that's just being mirrored across the EV charging space with new developments. I'll just mention that our high performance charging equipment is liquid cooled for high reliability, but it's got dry charging cables because they're also the most reliable piece of equipment. That's quite new in the industry. We're pushing up the charging speeds. It's all fully dynamic, so it doesn't matter what car you bring. It doesn't matter if it's a 400 volt, slightly older car. It doesn't matter if it's a brand new, ultra high fast charging car. The new chargers will charge at the speed up to sort of 720 kilowatts in our current products. So it's just a really exciting space, and I would encourage people to keep an eye out on the EV charging sector if they're not already. And maybe even to come along to some of our industry events. I think it's a really exciting time.
No, thank you so much for your time today, Simon. And that was a really interesting overview of the EV and an EV charging space. So thank you so much for making time for this.
Really enjoyed the discussion, Fabio, and thank you for your time as well.